yesterday, in addition to your little final exam assignment, right, we talked about, we finished the day with anchoring, right? We talked about anchors are very simple. They're the foundation, really, of every other form of learning that we get. It's always cause-effect. Two things are sandwiched together as if one is connected to the other, or it's an equivalence, right? I feel good, somebody's holding me, they must be the same. One causes the other, a la Pavlov, and it has a meaning. But if you think about it from a really meta perspective, both of those distinctions come from what? An anchor. Two things becoming one thing. Almost like we planned it.
Yeah, and you talk about it being impossible to think or speak without cause and effect or equivalence or awareness, even more so without association.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, this is where if we start from this perspective, we start from this understanding, a lot of things that are very hard, inapproachable or hard to really kind of cognitively grasp, if I can go kinesthetic on you, become much more approachable, and everything starts to kind of line up a little bit, right? And I think that's one of the beauties of NLP is that it casts such a big net that it caught all the radioactive nuggets. It just didn't tell you which of those nuggets were the radioactive ones. And I think, therefore I am, no. And I think we owe a debt, an extreme debt, to the founders, regardless of what you think of them from a character perspective or what they've done with what they discovered. They really did give us a tool for exploring our universe and cutting through a lot of bullshit. To finding out what are the things that are the same, the patterns, the structures, and from within those patterns and structures that we see that keep repeating over and over and over again, what are the differences that make a difference? And why? And how are they useful, right? Just the ability to move from nothing is good or bad, but it's either more useful or less useful is tremendously liberating, because we stop value judging ourselves or value judging the behaviors of other people. Yes, they may make us have a shitty, generate a shitty feeling, but that's just us, right? They're not making us do that, although we tend to think that that's how it works, right? So, be that as it may, anchors are really easy. You just name a state, describe it, link it to a phrase, a tone, a stimulus. And that's one of the big competencies that NLP wants you to be able to do as a practitioner, is being able to anchor in all sensory modalities. You saw me do it in 2, right? Very simple, stupidly simple, we talked about yesterday about collapsing anchors. And in a collapse anchor, again, whatever the problem is, fear of flying, passing out in the sight of blood, really doesn't matter what the situation is. You anchor it, and then you figure out, okay, what do I want instead, or what do I want to use? What kind of positive state or resource do I want to use to neutralize that? And you supercharge, you superstack that anchor. And then all you do is you fire both anchors at the same time, and then after 5 to 15 seconds, and that's a judgment call, you slowly leave your hand off the negative anchor, and it should just collapse that. And then you go back and you try and fire that other anchor. It shouldn't fire, or it should be so, and you just do it again, right? Which is another thing that people seem to not wrap their head around in a lot of techniques is repetition. The whole neurology is one of the fundamental aspects of its acquisition process is repetition. So like when spinning, if you're from a 0 to 10 scale, they're on a 9, you spin it, it drops to a 5, you do it again, it drops to a 4, you do it again, and you just keep going, right? So many people quit after one, sometimes two. The reality is you just keep going, and if you're still not getting the result you want, you ask different questions.
Maybe my question was, how many times do you typically repeat on the same technique before you pivot to another?
I watch their
cleaning?
nonverbals.
Okay, so it's
Right. Again, we created, after watching, having to go back and magic frame things so many times, because I started with the spin, I just made it standard operating procedure. You frame it before you spin it. Because if there is a reason for them to hold on to it, the frame will knock it out. And sometimes you don't even need to go to the spin because the frame fixed it. Right? And from that evolved what we call the Transformational Triad, which is magic frame, spinning, and color breathing. And you can do a whole practice, just on that, and pretty much nuke anything that comes in, because just do chains of those sequences. And because of how we've kind of mapped out the effects of the nervous system, you'll get a result. And of course, you have regression and holographic regression. So you have these deeper level tools. If you need to really go in and do some hypnoanalytics, is what we call it. Hypnoanalysis is actually the technical term for what a lot of regression is uncovering what the story is or how that story came to be. NLP just wants to know how you built it. Right? But when you put the concept of going back to the initial sensitizing event back into NLP, I think you get much more pervasive change. Because it's kind of like, you cut there's a dandelion growing in your yard, you cut the dandelion off, but you didn't get the root, so it just grows back. And that's what happens a lot. We talk about dissociation, right, which is where you kind of step out of yourself. A lot of people look at dissociation as a cure. And in my world, especially after 15 years of clinical practice where I have to shovel all the shit they dissociated from, because they dissociated from it so much, it became a tumor. Right? To me, dissociation is the equivalent of like half of your house is on fire. So you build a wall between the half that's burning and the half that's safe, and you assume the house is safe. Yeah, not so much, right? Stephen Parkhill said it best. I think it was in his seminar. He goes, "You will run out of body parts long before your unconscious mind runs out of ideas for getting your attention." Right? So at the end of the day, it's the things people stuff and try to forget about, try to ignore, try to deny, try to rationalize, that makes them sick. And that's all degrees of sickness. So the best thing we can do is move forward in life and fix our shit as it comes up. Pass the microphone to Mandar. Oh, he was going to get one in each hand. He's a two-handed microphone boy.
So this happened to me last night, and your perspective on what strategy you would use if you notice that the other person gets, even though there is rapport, the line of questioning gets so exhausting, like they just like kind of snap out, or they don't want to go there anymore. Mm-hmm. So what strategy do you employ when the other person is tired or exhausted or just doesn't want to answer questions? Or
well, the first thing I have to ask is what led to the exhaustive line of questioning in the first place?
Overload of languaging in the last 7 days.
Okay.
I mean,
when people get tired, they fall out of rapport. So you either need to give them a break or change the subject, which is analogous to giving them a break, right? But remember, the Metamodel is very taxing. You remember what you went through learning it. Imagine being the target of it, right? Where you because again, we respond to that deep, analytical, critical, unpacking our unconscious processes like we do to pain. We'll burn through our SRUs like it's nobody's business. Because not only are you parsing that, you have to deal with the emotions that it brings up. The things you didn't want to deal with in the first place that caused you to delete, distort, and generalize it. All right, you're throwing them right back in the shit, right? No mint on the pillow, no reach around. You're just, right? You gotta pace yourself a little bit, right? Little foreplay, goosing your reptile brain a little bit, but you get the idea. You can't just, you can't be like super invasive unless it's to your advantage to do that, like to get that person on the defensive, right? But when you see them getting physically tired, it's time to give them a brain break, right? Pattern interrupt, tell them a joke, let them go to the bathroom, give them something sugary, right? Because you're burning up those SRUs. They need it back, right? So what I'd like you to play with now is collapsing anchors. I'd like you to think of something on a shittiness scale of 0 to 5, 0 to 3 that you want to get rid of. Think about it. See what you see, hear what you hear, smell and taste what you smell and you taste. Anchor the feeling. And then think about what you want instead. Like, break the state, think about what you want instead. Superstack the anchor, right? And then when you're ready to get rid of it, do the deed and see if it goes away. Yay? Yes?
Can you please elaborate on superstack the anchor?
Well, how many times did I stack the pleasure anchor on Kevin?
I see. Okay.
Right? 10. Again, remember, 4-to-1 ratio. Right? I get 4 points of pain for one negative event. I get 1 point of pleasure for one positive event. So if you just think of 4-to-1 ratio in terms of the relative stacking of the anchors, you'll have a pretty good formula to go by. I would go 40, right? Just to make sure that there's absolutely no chance of that anchor surviving, right? And then in some cases, and you could also anchor dissociation, right? I know Mario and Ricardo and maybe even John may not have as much background on dissociation training. And it doesn't take long to teach it to you. But you can anchor dissociation so that if people start to go into an ab reaction, you just fire the dissociation anchor, and all of a sudden they step out of themselves, right? But the idea is, I don't view dissociation as a truly effective. I don't think it's as effective as the safe place. I don't think it's as effective as just color breathing it out or the frame game. But it's how NLP deals with ab reactions, so to speak. So it's worth learning, if for no other reason than you have an extra toolkit that you might one day actually need, right? Like if you're at the airport and you see people who are afraid of flying, if you just teach them to step out of themselves and look at themselves getting on the plane, their fear cuts in half. If you have them step out of themselves and then step out of that part and then look at themselves, looking at themselves getting on the plane, each time they go out, there's less and less fear. Really useful skill. I just don't like the way NLP likes to use it as a kind of catch-all. Yes?
I realize this may be a stupid question, but...
Yes! No.
There we go. I'm pretty sure I've proven that a false belief, but anyway. If you do disassociations to have them eventually to where they're not having a fear, like say for the flying example, once they feel that lack of, or they notice that lack of fear to where they're no longer afraid and they've disassociated enough, after a certain point, is it safe to start reassociating?
Yes, and ideally that's what you should be doing. The idea behind dissociation, it should be temporary.
Okay.
Right? Unfortunately, for most of us, our dissociation mechanisms are on autopilot. We don't consciously ever choose dissociation or association. We just flip back and forth as the context and the level of neurological arousal in us dictates. So if I'm moving through the world and if the trauma, on a scale of 0 to 10, right, you have T10, which is terminal event, right? It's either going to kill you, either going to survive it, or it's going to kill you. There's no, right? But there's a gradient from T0 to T10. At the trauma recovery mechanism activates at about a T9. And so what will happen is, just like when your word program spontaneously reboots, and then it gives you little prompts that, hey, this program closed unexpectedly. Would you like to restore it, or would you like to save the copy of it? Well, that whole little trauma bubble is a dissociated part. It's a consciousness fragment, but it's dissociated. It's not part of the host consciousness anymore. So it's stored on the body like a little fucking file on your hard drive, right? That's a trauma-based one. When we think of things we don't like, very often we automatically step out of the picture, and it's like we're watching ourselves on a video, right? As opposed to when we're playing a first-person video game where we're seeing all the action through our own eyes. Habitually, we tend to associate more into the things that we find pleasure in or that we enjoy. We tend to dissociate from things we find traumatic. Now, some people have higher levels of dissociation based on their lifestyle, their upbringing, their neurological predispositions. But it's a continuum. And the idea is to know what's the most appropriate way to be depending on the context you're in. If you're a first responder, being dissociated is highly desirable because now you're not at the mercy of all the chaos around you. You're not buffeted by intense emotions that are going to overwhelm your critical faculty and throw you into chaos. Whereas the last place you want to be dissociated is making love to your significant other. It's a good idea to be present so you can fully experience all those things. Now, those two extremes are every other form of dissociation that we have. Now, most people, they're either in the picture or they're not. But there are degrees of dissociation, just like the example I was giving. I can step out of myself and be watching myself. That's about as far as most people get, right? And then I can step out of that and watch that part. And the further I go out, the less connected kinesthetically I'm going to be to that process. Now, in the States, in the cases of extreme abuse, extreme trauma, those dissociated pieces start to take on an identity of their own. And they start to just associate in and out as the context changes. Because they start to take on a specific function. It's like a part, but they call it's considered a dissociative state because it's not the host, right? And I've worked with those, and you probably at some point, some of them will come across your bow, whether you actually choose to work with them or not. But dissociation is a skill for us. Association is a skill set, so we can choose what level to experience. Yes. Yeah.
So I wish we could practice this in this class.
You can practice it now if you want.
Yeah. So for approach anxiety, will this be useful if I do it on myself?
Yeah.
So watch myself feeling the fear and okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But with approach anxiety, wouldn't you want to dissociate out and then reassociate into a different state so that you actually are
Well, the
having an
idea is to
embodied
control your
resonance?
state, not run away from it.
Right, exactly. Like because you still want to have
That's
an
what
embodied
dissociation is.
resonance. Yeah.
Right? You can build dissociation into a meta frame, right? Where you're not, you have a little screen that kind of shields you from the bitch shield or whatever you're going to run into. But in my opinion, it's much more useful to just feel happy and playful, rather than, because again, where are you coming from? I need to dissociate because I'm afraid. Why am I afraid? Because they might reject me. Well, what if they didn't? What if the fear that you're holding about being rejected is actually priming their neurology to reject you?
Yeah, and when we're dissociated, it's very apparent on a kinesthetic level. So if we're dissociated out and we're approaching a woman, she's feeling that dissociation is going to feel a certain way as distinct from feeling really embodied.
Now, tactically, if the woman is somewhat dissociated, and you come in with that dissociate, and then you change, if you've gotten rapport properly, she'll follow you. Sensory acuity, kinesthetic rapport. Everything you learned in Killer Influence, CPI-1, Defense Against the Dark Arts, that's why we taught those things to you first. Because without the ability to sense and control yourself and then other people, these skills are largely just theoretical. Microphone?
Is that so? On a sales context, do buyers also, let's say, walk into a car dealership in a somewhat dissociated state?
To some extent, they are, yeah. Remember what I said when I taught you 3 magic questions. Human beings move through the world in a constellation of one of 4 possible states. They're either associated or dissociated, they're internally focused or they're externally focused. Most people move through the world operating and droning in a state of internal dissociation. Your job in 3 magic questions is to do what? Get them external associated. Why? So they're fully present and paying attention to you. When you're dissociated, you're not fully present. And that may or may not be tactically useful. Remember, it's not good or bad, right? If you have a nervous system that's hypersensitive and just overwhelms you at the drop of a hat, maintaining a certain degree of dissociation was probably a good idea until your nervous system learns how to deal with it in another way. But to me, dissociation should always be a temporary or transient process that you engage in. In the phobia cure, right? If someone has a phobia, they go from 0 to panic attack, like 10 level in the drop of a hat. And because of that, they don't have the cognitive resources to do anything but freak out. But if you have them step out, and then step out, and then step out, that intensity level drops to where they can maintain some level of cognitive control. They can access their resources, do the process, and lessen the emotional charge, and then step one place in, lessen the emotional charge, step in, but what you're doing is, once again, it's like bucket listing. The degree of difficulty is over at least 1. And that's how NLP uses dissociation for phobias or things like that. But what is that? What is phobia? It's a lack of state control. It's an inability, because your state is in chaos, for you to cognitively access your willpower, the things you do with your submodalities and stuff like that. If your system is in chaos, you can't. That's why we taught you posture and breathing first, because you can always do posture and breathing. It's really, really hard to screw up posture and breathing. Right? It takes the minimum amount of willpower to hold it or change it, right? And if you are that much in physiological chaos, then somebody probably needs to administer something to calm your ass down, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
Just gonna toss it out there, Mandar and whomever else, you might start to realize that a useful question might be, do I want to approach this person who seems highly dissociated, because what am I getting myself into if that's their default state? And what am I going to be expected to do if I move them out of that and they enjoy it? Food for thought.
Yeah, I mean, the first step is actually me.
It always starts with you guys. That's why we spent so much time on getting your shit under control.
Yeah, I mean, first thing is I want to be able to detect, are they associated or dissociated? Because I was not making
the only way to do that is talk to them.
Yeah.
Right? This is, again, go back to the very beginning. Echo technique, 3 magic questions. What does 3 magic questions do? It allows you to go up and talk to a stranger and figure out how to take them from dissociation to association. Right? All the while priming them to give you all the information you need to decide if they're a hell yes or a hell no. Right? Or some point in between. Right? Maybe after a few tequilas, that's somewhere in between. Right? So, in fact, why don't we kind of work the dissociation training into the anchoring? So the first thing I want you to do is pick something you want to get rid of, a body feeling you have in a certain context or whatever. I want you to anchor it. Decide what you want instead. Build that anchor, amplify it, stack it, and then collapse that anchor. Test it, right? And then build a state of dissociation and anchor it so that anytime you want or anytime you need to, you say the magic word, Shazam, or you do some kind of mudra and instant dissociation, and then test it and notice how well that works. All right, let's take let's take 30 minutes for this. Go. Shouldn't take you guys long. 30 on the clock.